That wasn't Santa on our rooftop. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I like that you have so many creepy stories from Pennsylvania on your show. I'm partial to those because I lived through one, and I'd like to tell it to you. It's a story about the Pennsylvania Dogman, so I think it would fit in with what you do. I like to tell my kids this story when we go to visit their grandma, aka my mother, who still lives in the house this all took place in and above and around. It quiets the kids down, and they don't dare misbehave when we get there. Meanwhile, my mother still to this day knows nothing about any of this. No point in telling her about it now. She's got a weak heart. This happened on Christmas Eve when I was a kid, and my brother was also a kid, but 1 year younger than I was. I don't remember exactly how old we were, but we were young enough to still be totally into Christmas. That year, as every year, we were put to bed early so that our parents could get everything ready for Christmas morning. They used to put up the tree, wrap the presents, put up decorations, everything the night before, then tell us that Santa did it and that it was magic. I already knew it was them doing it, and so did my brother Sam, but we acted like we believed them because we knew it mattered so much to them. Sam still believed in Santa, though. He just thought he shared the responsibility of Christmas with our parents, and that it was a joint effort. I was cynical about the whole thing, and felt that Santa probably wasn't real. I was still hoping something would change my mind, but there were just too many illogical plot holes in the Santa story, including the whole idea of coming down the chimney. So each year at Christmas, my parents would avoid inviting our depressed Aunt Margaret, but each year she would call them crying and saying she was going to self-delete. So my parents would inevitably give up and invite her over to depress us all on Christmas Day. This year was no exception. Margaret called. We could hear the loud argument downstairs as my father insisted that his sister-in-law had no right to ruin Christmas for his kids every year, and so on and so on. Other families repeat the same old Christmas records each December. Ours would repeat the same old arguments. Mom and Dad came up to our bedroom and looked in on us, so we pretended to be asleep. We heard them talking to each other, saying something like, "They're both fast asleep. We can drive over and get Margaret and be back without them even noticing we were gone." Once they left, we knew we had about an hour before they got back. That was 1 full hour to sneak around to see what presents we'd be getting the next morning. How do you think I found out that it wasn't Santa doing the decorations? Because this same thing happened every year. So as the two of us wandered around, oohing and eyeing at what presents we were going to have to act surprised about in the morning, something happened that year, which was different from any other year. Sam noticed it first, and he pointed it out to me. There was someone walking around on our roof. I listened, and there really was. It sounded like a heavy person, too. My heart lit up. Would I be proven wrong about Santa Claus after all? Sam was certain that's who it was, and he ran out of the house onto the front lawn to see. I followed, unable to believe this was actually happening. When I saw my brother looking up at the roof and smiling, I wondered why his smile turned to a look of confusion and then of horror. When I got to where he was standing and looked where he was looking, I screamed. That wasn't Santa on our roof. It was some sort of a werewolf, a hairy, naked animal that stood up like a man on its hind legs. It was looking into our chimney, but when I screamed, its attention was diverted to me and my brother Sam, and that was when Sam fainted dead away. I tried to get him up, but I couldn't. I was starting to get cold in my pajamas, and the werewolf was staring at me, edging down the slanted roof in my direction. I started to hyperventilate. I wanted to run inside and save myself, but that would mean leaving my younger brother outside to either be eaten by the upright walking canid or to freeze to death in the cold. I loved my brother back then. I didn't know what a louse he would turn out to be when he grew up. In those days, I'd have given my life to save his for what that was worth. I stared up at that werewolf, and I begged it to please leave us alone. I met its eyes, and I pleaded for the lives of myself and my brother. I thought that I could see understanding in the dogman's eyes. But then, it leaped down off the roof and bared its teeth at me. This creature was taller than my father, and it had rows of long, sharp teeth and a snout that was big enough to take my head off in one bite. It took one step toward me, then another, and I began to accept that it was all about to end for me. It had been a good life, I told myself, because I remembered a character in a movie saying something like that once. Actually, I had no other life to compare it to, so I didn't really know if I had lived a good life or not. I remember noticing that the creature walked on legs just like our neighbor's golden retriever's hind legs. It was far heavier than that animal, though, and its claws seemed far longer and scarier as well. I wondered if it would tear me apart or just eat me alive, but I didn't get a chance to find out. My parents' headlights swerved into view, and that dogman was suddenly not there. I don't know which direction it ran to, but it ran there fast, that's all I know. As soon as the scene was lit up, he was out of there. That left me and my brother Sam, who was still lying face down and unconscious on the front lawn in his Spider-Man underoos. It turned out my mother had forgotten something and demanded my father drive back to allow her to pick it up, so they were both in surly moods, even before they saw my brother lying there, looking as though he were deceased. I did some fast thinking and claimed that Sam had gone sleepwalking, and I was following him. My mother actually believed me, and I was quickly off the hook for committing Christmas spying crimes. Mom got us both jackets, then threw us in the back seat to go get Aunt Margaret. Sam woke up on the way there, groggy, thinking we were going to the drive-in movies. I felt incredibly guilty for lying about what happened to my mother, but she wouldn't have believed the truth anyway. I suppose I'm writing this as a sort of a confession. I know my kids believe the story, though. They have to sleep upstairs in that house tonight, and I know the idea terrifies them. If they hear footsteps on that roof, there's no way they're gonna think it's Santa. Not since I told them the story of the night that my brother Sam and I discovered that wasn't Santa on our rooftop. Dogman versus Krampus. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Right after the end of WW2 in Germany, in a bus or a truck or some sort of vehicle that was transporting a bunch of GIs back out of the war zone, my grandfather told me he saw a fight between Dogman and something that I would describe as Krampus. Grandpa was on the beginning of his journey back home to my grandmother, and they were about to have my father a year later. Even though Germany immediately after the war was still somewhat dangerous, it was officially over, and these guys were among the first who were going to be getting to go home. The men were tired but jolly, and they were singing sing-along songs from back in America. Suddenly, the entire vehicle bounced off the road, as though there had been a large explosion or impact very close by. The driver was one of the only people who could see what was actually happening, and he pulled to a stop. The men piled out of the back and came around the sides, only to discover something out of a giant monster film, the kind that would become so popular in the 10 or 20 years after this event. The well-trained military men took defensive positions and aimed their weapons at the display in front of them. They were ordered to hold fire until told not to, that they were only to use force to defend their position. And what were they defending their position from? Before I get into that, I think you should understand that I was told this story when I was a kid, back in the 90s, by my grandfather himself. If the whole Krampus thing had started up yet, I hadn't heard about it. And this was not told to me as a Christmas story either, although I do tell it to my kids each Christmas. Grandpa never said he saw Krampus, and he never said he saw a dogman. Grandpa told me that he and his fellow GIs saw, battling hand to claw in the middle of the street in Germany, I think in or near Berlin, what he described as two very large, primeval cavemen. One of the oversized men, he said, had antlers or horns on his head, not like a deer, but something more like a goat or a ram, but very large and formidable. He also said that the goat-like man had hooves on his feet. His face was very human, but with a horrible expression like that of the devil himself. Some of the men began to pray, believing that they were in the presence of the Lord of Darkness himself. This creature or devil was not colored red, as in the popular media of that time, but Grandpa said instead it had bright white fur, long, wavy, and shaggy, like a sheepdog. That was the fur on the head. The fur on the body was dark and long. The other monster battling there was a dog-headed demon, according to my grandfather. Equally covered in long fur, this one was more of a brownish or reddish hue. According to Grandpa, this one appeared taller than the other, but he stood more upright, with the Krampus-like monster bouncing around in a more ape-like fashion, bent over at the waist. The dogman looked like a human in most ways, but this was a feral human at best. Both creatures appeared savage and prehistoric, and Grandpa said that some of the guys were really thinking that this was the end of the world or something. They thought they had seen everything. They thought the war was over, and then here was this situation they were having to deal with that nobody on the planet could have ever prepared for. Grandpa retreated against orders to the truck and got himself some gas masks. He reasoned that they might be hallucinating this entire situation. Maybe there was some drug released into the air that was making them all just think that they were in the middle of a giant monster flick. Some of the other men had been thinking the same thing as him, and they eagerly put the gas masks on. But the two monsters were still battling there in front of their disbelieving eyes. When I was a kid and I was told this story, I imagined that the monsters were 15 or 20 feet tall, but I don't actually remember my grandfather ever saying anything like that. I didn't see an entire truck of soldiers being phased by two 6-foot-tall guys having a fist fight in the road. For them to have pulled to a stop, they must have been huge. They must have blocked the entire road. Everything that he said implied that. Grandpa never said they were driving through a narrow alley and this battle caused them to stop. He said there was an impact that caused the entire vehicle to bounce off the ground, and then the driver stopped. That implies that those monsters must have been large enough that they could cause minor earth tremors in the immediate area of their fighting. So maybe they were even bigger than I imagined. According to my grandfather, the Krampus man would lower his head and charge forward on all fours, somewhat like a bull, trying to run headlong into the more upright dogman, and that each time the dogman would time his leap, either jumping entirely over the Krampus, or else landing on the goat creature's back and snapping at his face and throat before inevitably being thrown to the ground and beginning the cycle all over again. It became quite violent. Grandpa mentioned rivers of blood flowing into the sewers that night, but none of it was human. The creatures smashed into the side of a building, causing a cascading effect that weakened the integrity of the next few buildings on the same block. The tops of these structures began to crumble and rain down on the street as Grandpa's commanding officer ordered them all back onto the truck. While the dogman and Krampus battled off to the right, their driver navigated the falling stones and drove them to safety. To Grandpa, this was his final battle of the war. He laid down his weapons and never picked them up again. My grandfather was not a very wild or crazy kind of a guy. He really didn't have any other good stories besides this one. His second best story was how he found out that the bear trap in his basement was worth $500 on Antiques Roadshow. He wasn't a drinker. He didn't exaggerate. He rarely drew attention to himself, and he never heard of Krampus in his lifetime. I personally only found out about Krampus in the 2000s, a few years after Grandpa had left us. Of course, he was the person I thought of first when I saw Krampus. It looked exactly like what Grandpa had told me he had seen. I think Krampus is supposed to have one human foot and one hoof, but other than that, his description was really dead on. Of course, I never heard of a giant Krampus before or since, so maybe that's not what it was. But what else comes close to that description? Maybe Goatman? Or possibly some kind of devil or demon. Grandpa also never heard of Dogman as far as I know, and he never called the creature that, or werewolf. It was always a giant dog-headed caveman that stood upright and tall. Not an upright walking canine, but a caveman with a dog head. So it's just my opinion, but I think this actually happened. And I think it happened in the middle of summer. But I tell it to my kids each year at Christmas. This year I was supposed to tell it to our youth group at church, but the event got canceled due to the government's crackdown on religious gatherings. The church asked me to tell it on Zoom, but I would really rather wait and hope that next Christmas is not ruined on purpose by the powers that be, and that we are allowed to exercise our basic rights of freedom of assembly and freedom of worship in our own country once again. If not, then you may have just heard the only public retelling there ever will be of my grandfather's tale of Dogman versus Krampus. Hey, do any of you like these adult coloring books or digital coloring books? I've heard that some people like them, so I made this one. You can print them out and color them by marker or crayon, or you can color them digitally in whatever manner it is that people do things like that. No, I did not draw these images. I'm the editor and the archivist. The price is $2.09 for over 60 images of scary dogmen and werewolves. We got werewolves chasing ladies. This guy here is running from a werewolf that already bit off half of one of his arms, it looks like. It's a crazy and fun, wild time. I guess you can judge for yourself if it's good for kids. I don't know. I don't have kids myself, so I can't really tell you. I know I would have liked it when I was young, but I don't know if that counts because I was a weird kid. Anyway, the link is in the description and the pinned comment, so check it out if you'd like to. Since it's digital, you can actually get it on Christmas Day as a last-minute present. The day after Hanukkah, Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Happy day after Hanukkah, everybody. I may be the only person in the world who celebrates the day after Hanukkah. Well, me and my older brother both. But we do it because it's the anniversary of when we saw the Dogman. For some reason, my mother decided that we had to visit our Tante Bela on the last day of Hanukkah each year. She didn't leave us anything in her will anyway, but Mom was convinced that we had to pay tribute to her on the final day every year. This particular year, it had posed a hardship for Tante Bela to even have us out there, and that led to my father arguing with my mother the entire drive out, then Tante Bela acting annoyed toward all of us while we were there, and finally my parents arguing as we began the long drive home. It sucked knowing that we had bothered the woman we had been trying to suck up to. Each year, my parents would give my sister and myself very small gifts each day of the holiday, but they would save up the good gifts for the final day, when we could open them in front of Tante Bela and, I guess, impress her or something. This year, we were driving home, having put the presents back in the trunk unopened as we got kicked out because Tante Bela wanted to have people over that she actually wanted to have there. It was pretty embarrassing even for us kids, so I can only imagine what it was like for my parents, and they tore into each other verbally as we drove away from the place. Now, when my Uncle Shlomo passed on, Tante Bela moved way, way, way out of Brooklyn. The town she lived in was called Dauphin, Pennsylvania, and it took around 3 hours of driving each way to get out there and back to Borough Park. That was on a good day, when my parents weren't arguing. When they were going at it like they were on that date, my father would miss every turn-off, blame my mother, get her screaming, then miss another turn-off, which he would blame on her once again, keeping the ball rolling down the hill, then up the next one. It was like a record set on repeat, if any of you know what a record is or was. I don't know where we were, and I don't know if either of my parents knew either, but it started to get dark, and we still seemed to be out in the country somewhere. Dad was sure, he claimed, that if we continued along this narrow country highway, lined on both sides with snow-covered trees packed tight to the edges of the blacktop, that it would lead to a way to get back on the toll road. My parents knew how to get home by paying tolls, but they were lost once they got onto local streets or wherever we were. My mother was incapable of holding her fears back, and she had to express the possibility that things could go wrong as often as she could, and with as much detail as possible. If Dad said this road would take us back to the highway, Mom would point out that it was possible Dad could be wrong, and that the road might lead us even further from where we needed to be. She wouldn't say that based on any map reading. She wouldn't even touch a map. She just wanted to point out that my father was just as likely wrong as he was right, and that we should always remember this. I'm not sure why she did it, but she never didn't do it, so it must have been meant to serve some purpose. My older brother was sort of the same way, but different. He would imagine nightmare scenarios, then tell us about them to get us worried about things that might happen, instead of allowing us to live in that moment or be happy. Sure, you think everything is fine, but you know what? Fate could be laughing at you. A rock slide could come down that tall hill to the left and crush this car with boulders. He'd point out that sort of thing. On this day, as it darkened into night, he started talking about all the kinds of weird people that might be in a dark forest in the country. Imagine there was a guy walking right there along the road, he'd say. Maybe he was carrying a big hammer. Why is he there? What if he asked us to stop and pick him up? We'd all yell at him to shut up, because he would really start to get us creeped out. He'd never quiet down, though. He'd always double down on it like, well, what if you sped up to get past the creepy man? And then he jumped on the hood of the car and screamed at us. We'd all shout at him again, while he asked us over and over, no, but seriously, what would you do if it happened? Seriously, what would you do? I'd like to say he grew up to be a great horror movie director. But actually, he inherited my parents' apartment and is retired. He never married or had any children, but he has a very large collection of independent underground scary movies. His motto these days is, never stream, always buy hard copies. He emails me when good old movies are re-released on disc, but we don't talk much other than that these days. Back then, we already called him the Spook Master, because he could make anything seem scary. If I had to go to the bathroom at night, he'd be like, dude, imagine you went down the dark hallway to the bathroom, and in the darkness, you felt fingers touching your feet. What would you do? No, seriously, what would you do? Eventually, we realized it was past midnight and was now officially the day after Hanukkah, and we were not home yet. Not only were we not in Brooklyn, but we weren't sure where we were. That might sound strange to say these days with GPS and so forth, but this was a long time ago, and we had neglected to even bring a paper map with us. We had seen no signs on this long, narrow road through the dark woods in well over an hour. My brother asking what we would do if a ghost appeared in the car with us, or what we would do if we saw Bigfoot staring at us from the woods, had thoroughly creeped all of us out. My parents were clearly now very afraid, as they had not said a mean word to each other in several minutes. We didn't know where we were. We didn't know where we were going. And, to answer my brother, we didn't know what we would do if we saw the Dover Demon outside either. And then, we saw something way, way worse than the Dover Demon. When teenagers saw that monster, they chased it. When we saw what we saw, my father slammed on the brakes and began driving in reverse. Because right there, in the middle of the thin road, stood a 7 or 8 foot tall dog that was standing on its hind legs. Or maybe it wasn't a dog. Maybe it was a man with a dog's head. It was too thin in the belly area to be a human in a costume, and the lower legs appeared too thin as well. The fur was gray, or at least looked gray in the headlights. It was patchy in places, as though the creature might have mange. The immense chest and broad shoulders looked human, sure, but still, it just could not have been. The ears were on top of its head, and they moved around like dog's ears. This was not a Bigfoot, and this was not a tall human. It was something else, and I think if the story happened today, it would definitely have been called a dogman. This was a genuine situation, like the imaginary ones my brother was always posing to us. What would you do if all of a sudden there was a 7 or 8 foot tall naked werewolf standing in the road? No, seriously, what would you do? I screamed. So did my brother and mother. I already told you that my dad hit the brakes, then put the car in reverse. And do you know what the dogman did? The dogman ran toward us. That made my dad scream louder than any of us. The creature sped up, still running on its hind legs. Dad sped up too, driving at crazy speeds backward, wobbling the car back and forth and left and right, unable to steer well backward and watch the monster running at his face in front of him. I was as afraid that we were going to smash into a tree as that we would get eaten by the dogman, to be honest. I did not consider my father a very good driver, at least not under stress. I remember that this was the first time in my life that I prayed without an adult telling me to. I prayed for us to get out of this uninjured, and for us to sleep in our own beds before sunrise. I remember thinking that we had to be doing 40 miles an hour backward, but that dogman was still gaining on us anyway. And then, the inevitable moment came when the creature overtook us and bounced with both feet on the hood. We all screamed and I ducked down in my seat. And then I heard the dogman running over the car and off down the highway behind us. I got up to look, and sure enough, the creature was racing incredibly fast, off into the night and out of our lives. Dad slammed on the brakes, then collapsed on the steering wheel and bawled openly like a baby. My older brother snickered at him. Then my mother lectured him that a real man cries, a real man is not ashamed to cry, and that he should only hope he grows up to be a man like his father, who can cry openly in front of his children. Then, Dad told Mom to shut up, and the two of them were off to the races once more. One of the benefits of being a kid was that I fell asleep sometime after that in the back seat. These days, an event like that would keep me from sleeping for over a month, but back then, it wasn't such a big deal to get over. The day after Hanukkah, Dogman. Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.